Thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this great series of lectures. Is my voice loud enough? No. Okay, so I need this closer. Is that better? I'm going to begin with a poem that has nothing to do with the topic directly. The year has 16 months: November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, 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 November. It's by Henrik Nordbrandt, a prominent Danish poet. And as you can see, it's about Danish nuances, shades of gray. A world inundated by stability and familiarity, not by stark contrast. What immediately meets the eye tells you less than what shows up in your afterthought. Daniel Libeskind, the famous architect, comments on his Jewish museum in Copenhagen in a way that both confirms and contradicts Nordbrandt's poems. After praising the 1943 rescue of the Danish Jews celebrated in this architectural work, he answers a local TV journalist who wonders why none of the angles in this structure, this design, are right. And to that he answers, Danes are obsessed with boxes, Lutherans in religious tradition, puritanical in spirit. Theirs is a right-angled culture, but as a democracy you should have 359 other angles. Perhaps his way of describing the endless Danish November, devoid of diversity and respite. What he may be overlooking, though, are the shades of gray, the nuances of the uniformity. To be sure, these nuances are not always positive. For instance, whereas the World War II rescue operation of Jews was undeniably successful, a sorry precursor was kept under lid for much too long. In the 1930s, before the Nazis even took hold of Denmark, the authorities overzealously returned German Jewish refugees to the fatherland, causing several of them unnecessary hardship, if not death. As for today, Jews in Denmark, as in the rest of Scandinavia, are basically, by their own account, a secure and seamless part of the national fabric. Yet, there are now quarters in Copenhagen and Malmö in Sweden where especially Orthodox Jews fear to travel by foot, certainly while donning their traditional headgear. Skirmishes may still be the exception, but no more so than one wonders how deeply the national harmony really goes. Can the infringement on Jews in public life be blamed entirely on the others and never on the so-called ethnic Danes or Swedes? Is there not a tendency among certain homegrown elites to even blame the Jews for upsetting these countries' new multicultural sensibilities by dressing provocatively or speaking out offensively in favor of Israel's policies? And couldn't the underlying problem be that the Danish-Jewish harmony has for too long been dulled by complacency and mutual self-congratulation, rather than being seriously confronted with its conditions of possibility? I'm not calling into question the big picture and its relative stability, but I am suggesting it conceals some alarming nuances. This is Scandinavia, and the devil is in the details, which shouldn't take us by surprise, since the historical record speaks in similar terms, namely of a relatively agreeable interrelationship, but one that was never as harmless and unproblematic as wishful thinking would have it. Looking back into the 19th century may offer clues to precarious aspects of Jewish minority life and Scandinavian culture to this day. It may not be an utterly spectacular story, but it is dramatic and intriguing in its own way, I believe. So I begin it with Hans Christian Andersen. This short little segment on top should give you the 5 steps in my talk. Andersen, and continue with Søren Kierkegaard, to mark the range from pro to philo-Semitic attitudes, in a certain sense of both terms. Then, after a short detour across the border into Sweden, where I inspect August Strindberg's anti-Semitic views in the late 19th century, I return to Denmark to probe the 3 most prominent Jewish writers in the wake of Andersen and Kierkegaard. And finally, I return to where I just started to make a point about the contemporary scene with its anti-Israeli and anti-Zionist aspects of multi-ethnic tensions in light of what history may have taught us about previous bouts of Danish anti-Semitism. So now to point 2 in the itinerary, stages of anti-Semitism in Denmark. My most important source of information reflection on this segment is a book by Peter Tudvad, Stages on Anti-Semitism's Way, from 2010. Its focal point, to which I shall return with a vengeance later, is Søren Kierkegaard and the Jews, as its subtitle reads. But Tudvad begins with a comprehensive review of Danish 19th century anti-Semitism overall. And I want to summarize what he says here as a background for my own review of Hans Christian Andersen's pro-Semitism, which Tudvad himself contrasts with Kierkegaard's anti-Semitism. Kierkegaard was born in 1813, which was the year of the opening salvo of a slanderous literary criticism targeting Danish Jews. The offensive ended in a rare display of downright physical violence, like a pogrom, in Copenhagen in early September 1819, precisely when the 14-year-old Hans Christian Andersen, uneducated, destitute, and lonely, arrived in the Danish capital in a reckless attempt to seek his fortune in the arts. Jews were physically assaulted, their houses and storefront windows bombarded with stones. This is a drawing from the events, but made much later, where you can see them attack storefronts in the central part of Copenhagen. Their windows were bombarded, their reputation defamed in parts of the press, and on it goes. Andersen recalled the scene in his 1855 autobiography, and I quote, "The whole city was up in arms." Remember, he had just been there for one day. Masses of people in the streets, yet all the noise and mess did not surprise me. It was precisely the kind of commotion I had expected in Copenhagen, the city of my world. Clearly, he was more excited and shocked by the experience, although in an earlier autobiography, he turns to be much more subdued than here. Now, the literary overtures to this brawl in the streets were ominous enough. Jews are prideful and stingy wheeler dealers with no scruples about sacrificing virtue and sacred duties for the sake of their trade, a kind of insects that can never be completely eradicated. Read some lines by the king's own Pastor Bastor. King Frederik VI himself, who reigned from 1808 to 39, was of a different opinion, as was the noted poet Jens Baggesen, whose humanistic gospel entailed a plea for an enlightened nation and a tolerant utopia. And when P.M. Münster, the future primate of the Danish church, published a favorable article on Lessing's Nathan der Weise, with its image of reconciled Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the anti-Semitic literary sentiment seemed to be subsiding. But for how long? 1817 was like the quiet before a storm, and true enough, 2 years later, the mob got out of the closet and took to the streets. Søren Kierkegaard was only 6 when they gathered outside his home, yet Tudvad surmises that echoes of the noise may still have entered his mind and fueled his own paranoia decades later when other mobs would chase him down the alleys, inspired by a Jew named Meir Goldschmidt. More about that chase later. The 1819 pogrom had started in Würzburg in Germany in the summer and moved via Prague, Krakow, and other Eastern European cities before it arrived in Copenhagen in the early fall. Anti-Jewish posters flanked the streets, and decent Danes like Pastor Münster responded as before with Christian humanistic admonitions to their parishioners. Meanwhile, the population at large and the Philo-Semitic king seemed to agree that enough was enough. So after a week or so of upheaval, troops were dispatched, but more importantly, tacit agreement was reached to suppress what had happened, or at least any mention of what had happened. Because of the link between the verbal assaults on the Jews in 1813 and the physical violence against them in 1819, the authorities actually relished in how some people's reservations in the past about the royal censorship of free speech had actually been put to shame by the recent events. Doesn't this go to prove that we need censorship so things like this does not materialize in violence, was the argument. Today we might see a battle line between those who point to harmful consequences of free speech and those who would defend it regardless. But 200 years ago, the reaction was more timid, with Jewish spokesmen assuring everybody that their flock was unreservedly Danish and beholden to no other kingdom. It was like everybody joining a politically correct conspiracy to put the best face on a national trauma. Nobody queried about what the initial mob of instigating communists actually thought. So instead of reaching a durable solution through earnest dialogue, a hollow conformity of right angles shaded in gray won the day. These actors inadvertently set the stage for decades of protracted tensions between the Jewish minority and the Danes at large, rarely resulting in physical menace to the former, but quite often leading into the grayer area of coded spiritual disenfranchisement. Before arriving on the Copenhagen scene of Jew baiting in 1819, Andersen had in school encountered a little Jewish girl in his Funen hometown of Odense. She later surfaced in poetic guise in some of his tales and stories about sweethearts. But his first major fictional representation of Jews was a novel called Only a Fiddler, 1837. Poor Christian, pun intended, and rich Jewish Naomi are from the same small town, but while his artistic talents lead nowhere, exotic Naomi goes places, marries into nobility, and becomes an emancipated lady of the world. Yet, as scholar Erik Dahl puts it, she remains rootless and unhappy, a Byronic, passionate type, and a wanderer, like Naomi in the book of Ruth. Dahl also claims that her Jewishness is not emphasized, which seems a benign reading that ignores implications of his own observation, that the indigent Christian's funeral procession must yield the right of way all into the ditch so a carriage with an overbearingly greeting Marquise Naomi can pass. Andersen's next Jewish piece is the tale The Jewish Maid, in a bowdlerized translation desemitized to simply The Servant. The title character is a Jewish girl, Sarah, poor and schooled among Christians, whose belief in the God-man she shares, though without betraying her Jewish roots and parents by converting. As a servant, she even reads aloud from the Bible for her widowed mistress, until she is so overwhelmed by the gospel that she collapses and later is interred outside the Christian burial ground, though not out of reach of God's sunbeams and promise of resurrection. Andersen says that thus balances tactfully between his own faith and the respect for the faith of the promise described. The American scholar Bruce Kearnsey disagrees both with that and with the servant's translator, because both subdue the tale's Jewish component. With condescending tolerance, he says, does Andersen accept his character's Jewishness, but only because she cannot help being who she is. This young Jew is for Kearnsey a tabula rasa onto which her Christian surroundings project themselves. Under Andersen's direction, the projection is enacted with the best intentions. He was known as a decent and philo-Semitic person and writer, well respected by and connected to prominent Jews at home and abroad, and genuinely observant of Jewish milieus on his many travels across Europe. But nonetheless, his enactment was such that without being considered anti-Semitic, as most other Christian constructions of Jews at the time were, his fabricated image of characters like Sarah became a revealing window on prevalent European prejudice about Jewish people and Jewish ways. The Servant, as Kearnsey reads it, is about Andersen grappling with two sets of related issues: the materialism of the Jews and the materialism of the new natural sciences. As an admirer of Goethe and a student of Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish discoverer of electromagnetism, Andersen shared in a philosophical and spiritual concept of nature, much unlike the emerging materialistic sciences. And likewise, his preference for medieval Christian absolutism and spirituality put him at odds with Jews whose perceived secularism and relativism entail a rejection of God's spiritual infusion into Jesus the man. At the same time, both scientific futurism and Jewish cultural otherness captured his imagination, leading him altogether to a compromise that proved fraught with mild condescension, masquerading as tolerance. Andersen, says Kearnsey, wanted to benefit from modernity without sacrificing historical continuity. And so recognition of Christian superiority was meant to dovetail with recognition of Jewish values, indeed with the notion of all people's equal value. Christian baptism was conjoined with philo-Semitism, and respect for the natural sciences was balanced against the fear of materialistic stuff. Kearnsey underscores the difference between Andersen's world of 1855 and ours today, and certainly our compromises are different from his. Yet Kearnsey may be exaggerating the disparity. Insofar as today's Danish Jews, their equal status in Danish society is undisputed. But is that not so because of an assimilation over time that has necessarily or voluntarily occurred on the terms of the majority population rather than on the terms of the Jewish community? Perhaps another gray area to consider. Two later novels by Andersen also feature Jewish characters. To Be or Not to Be from 1857 is about young Niels Bryde, whose last name associates to breaking and struggling, and who loses his Christian childhood faith, while his female counterpart Esther is a young Jewish zealot who converts to Christianity and whose death at a young age enables Niels' reclamation of his faith in immortality. While this book, in conjunction with the Jewish-Christian divide, as Kierkegaard points out, picks up on the servant tale's discussion of the conflict between faith and spirituality on the one hand and scientific materialism on the other, Andersen's last novel, called Lucky Peter from 1870, portrays simply a gifted young musician who dies on stage taking the bows after the first performance of his own Aladdin opera, and with its Jewish character in a purely supporting role. Many have called this character of an older Jewish singing instructor for Andersen's tribute to one of his own mentors as a young man, incidentally not a Jew, and more generally to admirable Jews in the elder Andersen's circle of Copenhagen friend. Scattered references to Jews and other works by this poet aside, there is one major, albeit often ignored text that stands apart from the rest and must be mentioned in our context. A strange and lengthy closet drama named Ahasveros from 1847, written over many years in part of an endlessly long tradition of Christian letters. Deliberately avoiding to discuss the legend of this wandering Jew who was sentenced to perpetual restlessness for refusing Christ a resting place on his way to Golgotha, it then limits his comments on Andersen's complicated drama to a summary of the protagonist's route through geography and history, where it ends temporarily in the company of Columbus in America. The crux of the matter is the author's, quote, respect for the wanderer and for some of his antagonists, the solidarity of the lonely man and untiring traveler Andersen with a damned figure from legend. Once again, the image of Andersen's Christian attitude to a Jew that we are offered by this scholar, a fellow Danish student of the poet and a distinguished older humanist to boot, is remarkably conciliatory and humanely balanced. Yet, we heard before about Bruce Kermsey, a younger scholar from a different American tradition, who was far more edgy and skeptical of this attempt at harmonious concord. The same irreverence marks his lengthy discussion, or the lengthy discussion of Ahasveros, entertained in this big book by Peter Tudvad about Kierkegaard. He's an even younger and more combative scholar, and his book about Kierkegaard and anti-Semitism includes a long section about Andersen, whom he quotes for advancing the idea of humankind rejecting the divine, yet progressing toward completion and insight. Thus, Ahasveros, whose very name means truth-teller, cannot be reduced to a single individual, nor to an incarnation of all the Jews. His despair is about God's grace as personified in the Messiah, whom Jews refuse to believe is embodied in Jesus Christ. Accordingly, Ahasveros is not blessed by his own corporeal resurrection, for that only ignites his endless wanderings as an eternal repetition of the same being he was before. Instead, he hopes for a greater prophet than Jesus, perhaps Muhammad, and envisions Muslims as allies in a common struggle against Christians, whose faith he continues to consider a falsification of Judaism. Not much smoothing compromise or comforting interface is to be had from this take on Hans Christian Andersen's wrestling with this major Christian Jewish legend. If you ask me who of these three interpreters of Andersen's sentiments about Jews holds the upper hand, Tudvad, Kermsey, or Eegdal, my answer would be the very disagreement between them does. For in each their way, all three reveal how costly harmonizing Jewish and Christian outlooks was felt by this paramount 19th century writer. Dal does it by accounting for Andersen's accomplished but admittedly labored humanitarianism. Kermsey does it for arresting the studied naturalness of the compromise he submits, and Tudvad for showing the unbridgeable chasm that remained even after the poet's best efforts. So the truth that emerges from carefully balanced shades of gray may not be more consoling than the truth that obtains when glaring disharmonies are brought out in the open. That's the guy who Kierkegaard. While Eegdal left the historical trajectory of the wandering Jew legend aside in his treatment of Andersen's Ahasveros drama, Peter Tudvad in his book devotes more than 100 pages to pursuing the legend and its points of impact on 19th century Danish literature. This way he could show how Ahasverus' affinity to Kierkegaard's life and work changes over time, and how these changes reflect the philosopher's changing attitude to Jews and their faith. His equivalent to Andersen's Ahasverus is a pseudonymous aesthetic author called A, one of Kierkegaard's principal works, Either Or, Part 1 from 1843, who feels he represents the age of despair in which he lives, an age dominated by lackluster pro forma Christians and reform-oriented Jews eager to accommodate Christian mores and ways. Yet, as a despairing individual, A is also at odds with his age, which is despairing in a more general sense. Eventually, A's despair is about God's grace and about his own self, while the age is despairing always over specific things or specific objects. Further down the road, A's despair about God's grace may even escalate and harden to the point where it is recognized as a punishable sin against God, and thus an impetus for the sinner to embrace God's grace and forgiveness in Christian faith and hope, at which point the link between A and Ahasverus, the wandering Jew, has obviously been broken. For the time being, though, in the 1830s and early 1840s, the aesthetic A and the anti-Christian Ahasverus are in sync with one another. Kierkegaard was interested in all the three mythological characters of Faust, Don Giovanni, and Ahasverus, representing intellect, sensuality, and defiance in that order, and calling for treatment in drama, lyric music, and epic, respectively. It's unclear if Ahasverus serves primarily as a literary incentive for Kierkegaard to incorporate even Faust and Don Giovanni in his treatment, which he does, or if he is primarily an expression of his author's personal sense of despair about God's grace, and of his and his father's bottomless melancholy and feeling of homelessness and isolation. But either way, Ahasverus marks a line of demarcation between Jewry and Christianity, which Kierkegaard desperately seeks to cross while putting the wandering Jew behind him. Certainly his A's despair is pointing toward a radical spleen, demonic in the sense of fearing the good, denouncing the finite self, yet unwilling to abandon this self for its absolute alternative. My sorrow is my castle, he says, in a characteristic aphorism, suggesting how split he is between the despair of his self and the doubt of his intellect. It's important to remember, as Tudvad reminds us, that Ahasverus, both in Andersen and in the young Kierkegaard, despaired not for fear of dying, but for being condemned to live forever. His attributes as the father of despair, in a certain sense, and as the adversary of Christ are two sides of the same coin. And in no way does Kierkegaard grant him the ability to intensify his despair to the point where he flips that coin in favor of the religious despair of a sinner who feels contemporary with Christ and whose sins may be forgiven by God's grace through his son's death on the cross. Nor does Kierkegaard obviously subscribe to the idea of the age as exposed by Heinrich Heine, the German poet, and let's see if I can get him up there, and other so-called new German poets, that Ahasverus stood for social and political emancipation from divine hegemony. Such secular and sensory perceptions might resonate with the pseudonymous A and his aestheticism, but they only served Kierkegaard himself as an important point of departure in his search for the Christian God. The turning point here seems to have coincided with the cholera epidemic in Copenhagen 1853, which took several thousand lives. It radicalized Kierkegaard's faith and drove Ahasverus more or less out of his sphere of interest. Now that he crosses that demarcation line between Jewish and Christian, which the wandering Jew had patrolled for so long, Kierkegaard can no longer accept Abraham as the father of faith for anybody else but Jews. To paraphrase Tudvad, Abraham is giving his son back after having proven his willingness to follow God's commandment that Isaac be sacrificed. The Christian test of faith would have been that he actually did sacrifice his son and only got him back in eternity. After this insight has settled in Kierkegaard, Ahasveros has done his work. Ahasveros can leave. His formerly impertinent defiance and rejection of God's grace in Jesus has now been overtaken by all of Kierkegaard's contemporaries. All these pro forma Christians whose complacent church he shall devote the rest of his life to fight to the death, literally to his death. In the last note he committed to his journal on September 25, 1855, a few days before he fatally collapsed in the street, Kierkegaard wrote of his ultimate faith and theology that God's will for life on earth is to take it to the highest degree of spleen and ennui. Only in qualifying for God's punishment by offending him severely may one receive his gracefully given eternity as a living reality. And neither the spiritless Danish Christians nor the defiant and worldly Jews will rise to this occasion, face the ultimate judgment, and lose their life for the hope of eternity in the resurrected God-man's loving forgiveness. So left behind in this scenario is the damned Ahasveros, with whom Kierkegaard reluctantly had identified before 1838, and to whom he remained both existentially and artistically beholden until about 1843, when he, Ahasveros, begins to get out of the way. First for the blessed St. Paul, eventually for the theology of Kierkegaard's final attack upon Christendom that I just outlined. The Ahasveros is left behind in the dying Kierkegaard's rare mirror is the inveterate Jew who is incurably in despair, even if reformed, as many of the Danish Jews were becoming in Kierkegaard's days, or baptized as Messianic Jews. Such pro-Christian accommodations can only attenuate despair, not convert it into redeeming faith. Rather, this Ahasveros remains the prototype of secularized individuals who have lost the religious intensity from which true despair about eternity derives, which means lost the most indispensable impetus for life on earth. This was the Christianity into which Kierkegaard considered himself a guide, and from which he always considered himself excluded, nonetheless. Now, is this an anti-Semitic record? By Tudvad's account and simple definition of anti-Semitism, as people expressing a hostile attitude toward Jews, the answer seems yes, but with certain reservations. As for the reservations, the tenor of Kierkegaard's quarrel with Jews is religious and theological, and less infected by the kind of racial bias that later became faddish. Tudvad's laundry list of his theological pejoratives include the notion that the grace of New Testament Jesus Christ is superior to the Jewish law of Old Testament Moses. The New Testament's God-man trumps Old Testament's Yahweh, and the Lutheran emphasis on New Testament faith prevails over Old Testament good deeds. New Testament Christian faith in mercy and grace is supposed to override Old Testament Jewish fear of guilt and the Jewish Pelagianism, which rejects the need for a redeeming Messiah. On Kierkegaard's view, Jews' concerns about expiating singular sins through sacrifice are inferior to Christian faith in the sinner's redemption of all sins before God. He claims the Jews understand all the negative commandments of the law, but not the positive one of loving God. And that Christianity is universal, whereas Judaism, like a fetish, is particular to just one people, albeit one whose persecution resonates with the young Kierkegaard's personal experience. Most importantly, Kierkegaard's Christian preference or Jewry is grounded in the notion that Christian you only become individual, while Jews typically, as a collective, are born as such. Subsequently, Kierkegaard goes on, the world of Jews is this world, and so their expectations for the Messiah are for another secular season. We have no other king but the emperor, as the high priest proclaimed, and not a spiritual king of eternity like Jesus Christ, whose appearance they therefore greet with harsh defiance. His gospel of ennui and hatred of man was rejected by the zestful Jews, while history was all for them. Nothing but eternity would matter for the Christians. You might say with Tudvad that Kierkegaard's Christianity perverts the natural as espoused by Judaism. And so when Jewry remains important to him, it is as the face about which his Christianity is elevated. Whereas Job is returned to life after succumbing to God's will, a Christian is called upon by the God-man to lose his life entirely and not reclaim it until eternity. This is how Kierkegaard, in the company of Ahasuerus, moves from an early pro-Jewish stance of despairing before the Christian gospel and toward an ardent anti-Jewish defense of Christianity. Eventually, Jewish images merely serve him as graphic illustrations of falsehoods within Christianity, like cautionary tales. In fact, the harshest among his images are directed at the Jew in himself, meaning those ethical and quasi-religious contractions in his own mental makeup that he felt prevented him from personally receiving God's grace in faith. For all anti-Jewish sentiments and depreciation of Judaism, as chiefly a theological train of thought and faith, this Kierkegaardian discourse may still prove benevolent compared to more recent concepts of anti-Semitism. But it may also be arrested for its insidiousness. Often Kierkegaard omits frontal assaults on Jewry outside the sphere of theology. His first book, for example, was a scathing review of Hans Christian Andersen's Only a Fiddler, the novel, with its hearty Jewish protagonist Naomi. At not one point does Kierkegaard allude to her for being a Jew. Instead, he compares Hans Christian Andersen unfavorably to the poet Heinrich Heine, who we just had up there, who, in spite of his outspoken Jewish secularism, is credited by Kierkegaard for an ingenious spiritual acumen which both Andersen and Danish performer Christians were sorely lacking. In another context, even lauds Heine for understanding the Christianity he doesn't believe in better than Kierkegaard's own pseudonymous author of the Ethical Treaty, Either or, Part 2. So, as Tudvad rightly points out, Kierkegaard was not primarily anti-Semitic, and many of his prejudices against Jews were widely dispersed in his culture. On the other hand, some people in that culture did not share in these biases, and nothing prevented Kierkegaard from joining their philo-Semitic agenda had he so wished. And even if his frequent usage of negative images of Jews was typically meant to illuminate Christian shortcomings, which were his main obsession, clearly persisting in having one particular faith and group of people signify the worst in others is no harmless act. His poisoned arrows may not have been directed toward Jews actually living in his city outside of Scripture, but the fallout from the rhetorical contamination of the cultural atmosphere that was inevitable when such a high-profile writer articulated his venom could hardly have left real Jewish people's sentiment and reputations unscathed. In fact, there are chilling examples of his theological bile spilling directly over into anthropological and ethnic anti-Semitism, as it happened when he lashed out at Meir Goldschmidt for the satires of Kierkegaard he had published in his magazine, The Corsair. These were cases of malignant projections of the troubling inner Jew onto contemporary Jews in Kierkegaard's immediate world, and cases where his indirect anti-Semitism certainly borders on directness. That said, Kierkegaard's relentless effort to profile a radical and fundamentalist Christianity at all costs, often at the dual expense of humanists taming the gospel and Jews offending it, may have been less problematic long-term than many compromises between Jews and Christians in the 19th century Danish public sphere. The unholy alliance between Bishop Mercer and Mendel Nathanson, the great eminence of Copenhagen's Jewish community, Kierkegaard rightly accused of discrediting the integrity of both faiths in the name of harmony. By contrast, his own rejection of Christian nationalism never tempted to caucus with Jews without a country. He even stated that, quote, if any people were entitled to relate to Christianity, it must be God's chosen people, and even their nation went under and has remained a memento of Christianity's incongruence with nationality. This kind of brutal clarity may have been a healthy antidote to the kind of conciliatory tones that were struck by his opponents among the Jewish and Christian powers that be. For while the muddled greyness they left behind may not have been a fertile ground for anti-Semitism per se, it did render both Jewish integration half-hearted and resistance to anti-Semitism lukewarm whenever it surfaced. I move to my post-luke. Strindberg, Goldsmith, Brand, Dickens. He should remember that Jews in Scandinavia, quite few in numbers, generally fared better than Jews in most European countries in the 19th century. That's why it's important to recognize how even these best of circumstances were flawed. Andersen and Kierkegaard's Denmark was spared glaring disruptions of Jewish public life to the extent the more subtle, existential, and spiritual ordeals that were nonetheless inflicted upon Jews can be explored without too many undue disturbances. Even seemingly harmless shades of gray deserve to be put on the spotlight and revealed for the misleading illusions they offset and for the unsettling disharmonies they engender. Let's first move our focus a bit into the future and away from Denmark to Sweden around 1880 and its most prominent writer, August Strindberg, whose hostility to Jews was quite poignant, though few cared to discuss it before Nina Solomon did so in 1999. Though Strindberg's anti-Semitism, unlike Kierkegaard, was neither religious nor theological, it too was shared by men in the majority culture for stereotypes like Jews deal only in usury. They see themselves as a noble class, unwilling to mix with others, and therefore remain always Jewish, never Swedes. At the same time, we are told that Strindberg's hatred of Jews was exceptional even for his time. In liberal and free-thinking circles, at least, anti-Semitism was not acceptable, but was rather viewed as something demeaning and narrow-minded. And that Strindberg himself made a point of apologizing for his attitude to the Danish Jewish critic, Edvard Brandes. It is also true that Strindberg generously offended many other causes and groups of people and showed great inconsistency in both his praise and scorn, and that Jews, he declared, had exploited him and squeezed the brain and the blood from his body. He later extolled for being the salt of the earth and Europe's most intelligent people. Be all that as it may, as recently as last year when Swedes celebrated the centenary of Strindberg's death, scholars disagreed on his pronouncement on Jews. Some called him grotesque, way beyond the pale, while others defended his record, either by shrugging off its blemishes as minor in the historical context, or by seeking to balance them against the man's artistic virtues. While this discussion fails to expose the scope and root causes of Strindberg's problems with Jews, Solomon takes a historical view of Jewish life in Sweden that somewhat parallels the situation in Denmark. I'll cite a key passage from her text and then turn to briefly discuss these three Danish writers, all Jews, whose life and work show intriguing responses to the dilemmas they too experienced in the later 19th and early 20th century in the wake of Kierkegaard and Andersen's generation. Solomon writes specifically about Strindberg's societal background. The immigration of Jews to Sweden at the end of the 1700s, and also their gradual emancipation in the 1800s, had been initiated by the king and the nobility, all for economic reasons, since the Jewish immigrants brought money and know-how with them. The bourgeoisie and craftsmen, on the other hand, were traditionally hostile toward Jews. They saw these newcomers as rivals and intruders on their own businesses. Not until the second half of the 1800s, when the new liberal economic standpoint had taken hold, did they stop seeing the Jews as a threat. Tine Bakker, whose research I lean quite heavily in the following, calls each of these three Danish Jewish writers, Goldschmidt, Brandes, and Nathanson, a marginal double, a borderliner who views and is viewed, and who refers directly or symbolically to his Jewish identity, which in turn is both generic, numerical, and qualitative. The three authors all undergo and articulate a so-called Bildungsprocess, an existential and spiritual education, often described in the Danish context as the restitution of Adam. It means that we all live after the fall, when paradise was lost to capital sin, and that we only understand the history of our individual life in this light, namely by reclaiming it, which we do when we internalize the order of its plethora of sinful experiences until we become one with this order. For better or worse, this is me, and now I know it, for as my spirit has tuned into the orderly course of my life, it has been reborn. And so these three Danish lives and spirits end up symbolically and spiritually shaped as three phases of Jewish history. Goldschmidt as the exodus from Egypt, Brandes as the wandering in the desert with no oasis in sight, and Nathanson's in longing in vain for the promised land. As years after years as a marginalized Jew, Goldschmidt comes to appreciate the common origins of Christianity and Judaism, and in doing so both overcomes the conflict between them and reconciles himself with being a Jew. He suddenly sees himself in a wider and deeper context. His own origin and the origin of the world, its creation, come together to make sense in his mind. He who was Kierkegaard's personal nemesis was involved in a much larger nemesis, namely that the entire order to which he now feels he belongs is the product of a historical fall. What had been lost to crises and defeats can be manifold reclaimed, and thus Christianity is merely a station on the road to a bright and spiritual theism. Its protagonist leaves home for years of homelessness that fails to return home afterwards. Yet his rootless borderline position as an observant double between Jewry and Danish Christianity suggests how Jewish freedom can be utilized artistically to amass complex insights that move the classical Bildungsnovel a step in the direction of modernity. It was from here Georg Brandes, this was Goldschmidt, and here is Brandes. The modern critic par excellence gave the novel surprisingly, Goldschmidt's novel, The Jew, surprisingly high marks. For judging by appearance, Brandes was a firebrand, ushering in the very modern realistic breakthrough in Nordic literature, compared to which Goldschmidt, for all his realism, was still steeped in romantic idealism. Later, Brandes himself admitted to being a romanticist who had spent his life fighting romanticism. And so his ear for Goldschmidt's romantic tones was quite in character. As it turns out, Brandes was also a Jew who spent his life combating Judaism. According to the American critic Henry Gibbons, labeled him the reluctant Jew. And from this emancipated and assimilated position, Brandes saw the Jew in Goldschmidt as an old-fashioned outsider, a nostalgic romantic identity politician. Unlike Goldschmidt, who considered it a virtue to be Jewish, for Brandes it was a necessary evil, unless inspired by Hellas and committed to rational free thinking and technological progress, like a modern Prometheus and a poetic Jew like Heine. To be sure, not even baptized Jews were safe, as their blending into the Christian majority was cause for extra suspicion. So eventually Brandes scraps all claims to ethnic origins. Even the notion of Scandinavian Jews as Semites, although ironically he himself continues to be judged by the national norms he completely rejects. All in all, he ends up as a house divided, neither Dane nor Jew, distances his Jewishness from his Christian Denmark, and only confirms his controversial identity by projecting it onto subjects in his biographical research. He even goes so far as to refuse meeting with Ashkenazi Jews for fear of expressing anti-Semitic statements. and what little sympathy he may have left for Jews relate to their plight as a persecuted minority, and expressly only one of many whose equal human rights Brandes vigorously defended. As for Zionism, he does accept it, but only reluctantly and for the Ashkenazi only. Like Kierkegaard, to whom he devoted a whole book, Brandes puts individualism in opposition to dualism and molds his image of the public intellectual on the modern Jew, happy, tragic, and hopeless. All the same, his anti-Semitic surroundings, even philo-Semitic critics like Gibbons, continued to cast him in Jewish roles. This seemed the inevitable outcome of an interplay between Jewish minority and the cultural milieu at large, and Brandes himself came to begrudgingly accept it, although it was meant to ostracize him. He knew from Heine's case of how futile assimilation could be, and ended up in splendid isolation, trying to define himself who he really was, with only broken ties to the old and few to the new. The intermediary and compromised, detailed and petite style of Goldsmith's work offended him with its many shades of gray, because he wanted a much bolder image, strived to liberate a big utopian picture and energize the young, even some older. But his very identity as a Jew or non-Jew escaped these efforts completely. And when Henry Natanson, in his large volume on Brandes from 1929, meets the same challenge Brandes himself met, but different, by elevating the very Jewish heritage Brandes had sought to downplay, the result is an opinionated race psychology rather than a critically documented work of scholarship. His well-intentioned refutation of traditional anti-Semitism proved further outdated after the Holocaust and the fall of fascism. But he did diagnose correctly Brandes' form of double view as a blindness on both eyes. Danish, which he wasn't, he insisted on being, and Jewish, which he was, he insisted on not being. What insight could come from this? Natanson himself wrote instead in the tradition of Goldsmith, but with a touch of the modern despair this precursor had not. Accordingly, he found in Goldsmith a homeless Jew, but one with a home inside his Jewish soul. Brandes, there was no such refuge or respite to be found anywhere. While attitudes to Jews had to be softened much, Natanson's artistic heroes do not challenge them, but seek accommodation all the same with their Christian surroundings, while trying to preserve their own Jewish identity. They must accept this identity as a given and then fight for equal rights, hoping for a common humanity while realizing they will continue to be frowned upon. Once deemed a stranger, you are out for good. So the result of this low-keyed insistence, unlike Goldsmith, Natanson has only few Jewish protagonists. The results are quite depressing and only confirm what Brandes knew too well, namely that assimilation is a futile exercise. Trying to be a Dane and a Jew at the same time comes at the expense of both identity and freedom of speech. Jewish emancipation is a double-edged sword that energizes the life of the people well beyond their traditional hallmarks in synagogue and Talmud, but also animates new anti-Semitic fervor. And so Natanson concluded that only Zionism was the way out that could unite the old and the new, or could it? When he committed suicide in Sweden in 1844 as one of the Jewish refugees from occupied Denmark, he might have found he was talking to deaf ears and that even this way out was a dead-end street. A kind of spiritual fatality also to be counted among those memorialized in Daniel Lieberkind's Jewish Museum. I believe Natanson died as Goldsmith and Brandes before him as a canary in the cultural coal mine. And I think Jewish intellectuals even today are good censors to tell when public discourse is running out of oxygen. My examples tonight have been battling with others or internally with themselves the temptation in cultural discourse to settle for the lowest common denominator. Call it the inoffensive, grayish, frictionless melting pot of fictions, which don't cause much harm, but don't do much good either. One admittedly controversial Danish historian puts it well. In a way we Jews, this was written 2010. In a way, we Jews have become an anachronism because we are into the past. The Danes have already forgotten most of it. While we live in the memory of our misfortune, at the most they live in the happy memory of their liberation. This is a land of oblivion, where history is merely a merry memory about a spirited king or queen. There's no pain in Danish history, no self-searching. Everything has become a sentimental, dear memory. Conversely, Jews and those non-Jews who have for centuries been grappling with complex minority cultures in a turmoil within larger social cultural domains have better, disparate experiences and insights to offer. And are they needed? When the challenge to Jewish identity in the schools and the streets persists in some of today's allegedly most harmonious social environments, like the cities of Denmark and Sweden, it suggests that too many different specimens of our culture's canaries have been gasping for air unnoticed, and for too many years of 16 months each. So, take note, as Kierkegaard, this loud-mouthed Christian canary, said when he witnessed the majority of culture's decline, and all too often fell for the temptation to compare his scapegoat to a Jewish canary. Something the debate about Peter Tudvad's book revealed that several good Christians and Kierkegaardians still consider a tempest in a teapot.